Hello everyone, it's Matt McLachlan here, producer of Peter Hart's Military History, and just a couple of very quick housekeeping announcements before this week's episode. Firstly, the British Podcast Awards are coming up, and voting is now open for members of the public, so we would really appreciate it if you could log on and cast a vote for Peter Hart's Military History. It would really mean a lot to Peter and Gary, and they'd get a real thrill out of receiving your vote. The website for that is britishpodcastawards.com/vote. So britishpodcastawards.com/vote. If you could jump on there and cast a vote for Peter Hart's Military History, it would be greatly appreciated. Also, check out the new podcast series we now have available, a sister podcast to Peter Hart's Military History. It's called Treasures from the Vault. And in that podcast, I examine wonderful items and historic documents in great museums and archives around the world, and then talk about the history that relates to those items. So go to your favourite podcast app, check that one out. I'm really excited about it. It's been really popular in its first couple of weeks of launch. It's called Treasures from the Vault. We've got stories on Jack the Ripper, Shakespeare's first folio, the first Japanese Zero shot down in World War II. There's lots of great history there to be found on Treasures from the Vault. And the last bit of housekeeping news, and probably the most important, is the Gallipoli evacuation book we've been talking about. We're currently editing it. It will be released, printed, published in September, but it's going to go on sale from June. The pre-sale is going to begin in June. And if you order the book via our website, which is livinghistorytv.com, you will receive a special bonus from Peter Hart. And that is a wonderful interview with Peter, a private interview that only people who buy the book in the pre-sale will receive. And in that interview, it's basically a behind-the-scenes look at the construction of the book. Peter's going to talk all about his motivations for writing the book. He's going to break down each chapter, each period of the evacuation, and talk about it in detail. And most importantly, it's going to include the audio files of the veterans that he spoke to in those decades as the oral historian in the Imperial War Museum. So you will get to hear Gallipoli veterans in their own voice telling you what it was like to be at Gallipoli. It's going to be a wonderful interview with Peter Hart, really a director's cut behind the scenes of putting the book together. So you will get that for free if you order the book during the pre-order period, which begins in June. So look out for information about that pre-sale. It's going to be on our website, livinghistorytv.com. Pick up the book when it comes out in September. In the meantime, enjoy this week's podcast.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years, I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History.
Hello, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History podcast. And today, as ever, I'm with Gary Bain. Hello, Gary. How are you?
Hello, Peter. I'm very well. It's quite unusual not being able to see you as we do this.
A blessing, I'd have thought, Gary. A blessing.
In so many ways. It's very early in the morning too. I hope you don't mind. I'm naked.
Well, I can imagine it. I can imagine. Excuse me. I'll just use this sick bucket that happens to be next to me. People might notice the sound's a bit strange. The internet's struggling a little bit during with the extra demands for people downloading big and bouncy and all the rest of it. But we're here to do our podcast today, and the subject is the South Notts Hussars again. Wow, it's what a coincidence.
I know, we seem to be doing that rather a lot. I can't think why.
Well, I wonder what my publishers would say if they knew that we were continually talking about the South Notts Hussars, who feature in my book At Close Range, a life and death or something in an artillery regiment at war. I ought to learn that title as well, oughtn't I? Anyway, yeah. It's out in May, and we'll all be dead by then. So,
Or out of lockdown, in which case we could all rush out and buy it.
Oh, Gary, I'm sure you'll get a free copy.
Thank
you. I'll sign it in such a manner that you'll never be able to put it on the internet for sale.
Bugger.
Yes, bugger indeed. Now, so what we're doing today is the South Notts Hussars when they get to Mercer Matruh, and it's this thing between what we've been looking at is like pre-war, peacetime. Then we looked at when the war starts and they're in England, and of course, that's not they're at war, but nothing much is happening. They're just training. Then they move to Palestine. We've talked about that. And again, that they ramp up the training there. And then finally we get where we are today, which is when they deploy into action. And again, it's not mad frenetic warfare, but they are moving into a war zone.
And who are they expecting to fight, Peter?
Well, they're expected to fight the Italians, which is a bit of a surprise, I suppose, for First World War historians, because Italy had been on our side in the First World War, and they'd fought with incredible heroic bravery in the battles of the Isonzo, something that people forget when they're laughing at Italian military skills. But actually, the Italians had an amazing record in the Great War of courage and commitment. But when Mussolini took power, he'd been looking to build up an African empire, and he'd already launched a war against Ethiopia in 1935-36. And it started to build up an Italian empire based around Libya and Ethiopia. And when he saw what was happening in the Second World War, let's be honest, we weren't doing too well in 1940. Dunkirk had occurred. Everything was, turning to shit. And he saw a chance for grabbing colonies in more colonies in Africa.
Yes, of course, I think, looking at the Germans were having some notable success, certainly on the Western Front at that time. And I think it's fair to say that they didn't have a lot of choice, because I assume Germany would have turned their attentions to Italy had they not joined the Axis.
Axis?
Or even Axis.
What is it about pronunciation and podcasts? It seems to send us mad. Yeah, I think that's also must have been in their mind, but I don't know that. I think, again, this is one of those times when I point out that we're not always experts on things we talk on. But the point is, once Italy came into the war, it changes everything because the British forces in Egypt have to be put on a high alert. And there was an obvious risk of them coming across the Libyan border and pushing into Egypt. And that means that the huge naval base, it's the most important naval base probably in the Mediterranean, at Alexandria, that would be threatened. Cairo, the capital of Egypt, would be threatened. But worst of all, the Suez Canal. And that is sort of the lifeline of the empire. That's the route to India, the Far East, and what I like to think of as the colonies, Australia and New Zealand.
So did the Italians underestimate the strategic importance of Egypt to the British?
I'm not sure they underestimated. I think they knew the strategic importance, but they just wanted it for themselves anyway, if you know what I mean. So they were pushing into Egypt, or rather they weren't, but they threatened. When they started the war, when they came into the war, I'm not sure I told you the date, 10th of May. Sorry, when they started, it's. What are they going to, everybody's wondering. So what happens is the British move the first elements of the 1st Cavalry Division up from Palestine into Egypt just to bolster the defences in case something happened. And part of that was the 107th, the Royal Horse Artillery, the South Notts Hussars. And they had to get mad ready, They got all the best equipment from the other artillery units in the division. They got this, that, the everything. And can you imagine what it was like for the poor old quartermaster sergeants and the rest of them? I mean, you can picture that scene, I'm sure.
You've mentioned before that when they moved previously, they had all manner of kit with them, including the officers' mess kit. What sort of stuff did they take on this deployment? Because this was real, wasn't it? This was happening.
This is on a war footing, so a lot of that extra stuff would be packed off and sent home or just left in Palestine. Yeah, this is a war deployment, and so they go off by train. You mentioned the importance of trains before. Again, it's everything's it's the best way to move things. And they set off chugging to Mersa Matruh was where they were going to be deployed. Which is it's basically a seaside resort about 180 miles west from Alexandria. Can you picture that? And there they'd face the Italians. Well, they wouldn't. The Italians would be miles away on the Libyan border, but they'd be facing them indirectly. And they entrain on the 23rd of June 1940. Breaking their journey at the Kantara Junction, they get off one train and get onto another one. And here they have I remember when I interviewed them, it's First World War, Second World War, whatever they are, the veterans would always say, and then the Egyptians would come along the side of the road going, eggsy bread, get your eggsy bread. Eggs and bread. That's a translation for you, Gary, in case you couldn't.
Thank you.
Yeah, I knew you'd appreciate that.
So can I just ask, we've mentioned on previous podcasts, I won't go over it again, but they had old 18-pound Great War artillery pieces. Have they now got the 25-pounders when they move?
Oh, no, they're still with the 18-pounders. They're not 25-pounders are in short supply, and they go to the regulars first. The South Notts Hussars are TA. Anyway, they board the trains again at Kantara and set off the other side of the canal, set off for Mersa Matruh, where they met the advance party, which was under the second in command, Major Edward Batt. His name will crop up again, I'm afraid. And they
could pronounce that one.
I can. Batt's pretty easy. And then, he made a terrible joke, but I'm glad I stopped myself. Because it doesn't end well for him. And they joined the 22nd Infantry Brigade in defending the western approaches to Mersa Matruh, while units of the Egyptian army, the Egyptians, would guard the eastern perimeter, i.e. the safe side. This is fairly typical of the British Army. And the 107th RHA, the South Notts Hussars, were replacing 1st Field Artillery. Now, they'd been warned there might be Italian air raids, high-level Italian air raids by the Caprioni bombers. And Ray Ellis was one of the best people I ever interviewed. He had a way with words, and he gives a description of the first time he was caught in an air raid. And I think there's no jokes here. There's nothing but horror. And I'll read his description. I think you'll agree with me, Gary. It's pretty emotive. He says, I heard a screaming sound, and the next thing there was this vicious explosion, and I hurled myself to the ground. It was a stick of bombs falling, but I didn't know at the time. I hadn't heard any aircraft, and there'd been no air raid warning. There was this devastating flashing, crashing, and a blast. I was absolutely bewildered, and then it went quiet. And then there was another scream, and a soldier came out into the street. He was holding his guts in, and all his stomach had been torn open, and his entrails were trickling through his fingers. It was an awful sight. He was screaming, and he sank to his knees. His screaming changed to a gargle, and he just sort of dropped almost at my feet. I was appalled. I was terrified, horrified, and stupefied. He was the first man I saw die. And he was only, 19, I think he was. And this is, no humour here, is there, Gary?
No, that's horrific. What an introduction. The first person that he sees dies, and that's just awful.
It is. And this is the thing about war. And I hope our podcasts reflect the soldiers' view, which is that they'll laugh at anything, they'll put up with anything, but then in between all the humour and the laughing, there's this nerve-shredding horribleness. That's war. Anyway, they'd have to get used to that. What they do is they take over the gun pits left by the first Royal Artillery, 1st Field Artillery, and these were quite big. There's some dugouts, and some of them were 12 foot underground and all the rest of it. But then, and they had slit trenches, but then they were moved out and took up anti-tank positions because, of course, they feared the Italians would arrive in tanks. So they moved
Did they
out.
have any anti-air as well, or was it primarily anti-tank?
They had some anti-aircraft defences, but that was an Egyptian unit, and I will come back to that because later on there's a great story. Well, there's a couple of they're almost racist stories from the lads about that. I'm afraid you'd expect that with the attitudes of the time, but they took a humorous view of the anti-aircraft. The anti-aircraft defences weren't great, and there were no effective fighters because the Gladiators were all they had, and they were far too far away. what was happening that might mean that there weren't Spitfires and Hurricanes?
Well, I think timing-wise, wasn't the Battle of Britain raging at that time?
Yeah. So of course, any spare Spitfires, any spare Hurricanes, they were back home. They were defending Britain. Of course, they were defending Britain. Anyway, so the lads they move out and they start building their own gun pits. And this is classic because the British Army never changes. You want stuff to build gun pits. You want what do? Do you you steal it?
I knew where that was going.
You steal it. And which noted British organisation provides materials, whether they want to or not? The Royal Engineers, the sappers. So they built these fantastic gun pits and they covered them over and built this and they had railway sleepers and all sorts of things. But of course, as they said, when they gained experience, they realized they just made death traps because they'd have been caught in there. They had a very limited field of fire. They were almost like turrets by the time they'd finished. That's not what they would do when they were desert veterans a year later. Anyway, the bombs keep falling. What they are, they're these Italian Capriones, Savoy Machete bombers. Should never have tried that. I should have just said high-level bombers. And they're flying 10,000, 20,000 feet high, whatever it is. And there were lots of really almost miraculous escapes. Here's one, two of my favourites. Troop Sergeant Major John Whitehorn, and he was talking about a chap called George Pearson. George was, I think, the first South Notts Hussar I interviewed. He was a wonderful old boy. And he said, and John Whitehorn said this, there was a raid came over, and from our dugout entrance, we saw George Pearson walking across. He made a dash for a slit trench and disappeared into it. When the raid had gone, we saw that where the slit trench had been, there was a black mark. And we said, alas, poor George. But George got up out of the black circle and walked away in the wrong direction to start with, but then turned around and went in the direction he was going originally. Obviously a bit shocked. And it's almost like a Laurel and Hardy. You can just imagine him getting out or setting off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, all black and frazzled. That's very good.
But then you see, that's the humour we talked of. But then this is driver Harold Thompson. And he was getting nervous. He said, it did get to you. You were forever on the alert, listening all the time, see if you could hear a drone, looking up all the time, especially if you had to go somewhere. You wouldn't say, how far is it? You'd say, how many slit trenches is it away? So you'd dart from slit trench to slit trench. You wouldn't necessarily get in, but you'd be ready to dive in. Say, I had to go from the gun position to headquarters. Before I set off, I would be looking all around, then run like the clappers to a slit trench, get down, have another look, and so on till I got there. That's how it affected you. People got really scared. Now, this is the anti-aircraft. There were 6 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. And this is what George Pearson, the same bloke who had the close escape, said. We used to say that just before a raid, the Egyptians would knock hell out of the sky. Then, while the Italian planes were over, they were very quiet. And as soon as the planes had gone, they knocked hell out of the sky again. And I think that sums up the British attitude then to their Egyptian comrades. I fear it's not good. But
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Given that there's no air cover, you mentioned there's no air cover. Why did the Italians persist in high-level bombing? Why didn't they try some low-level bombing as well, which I presume would have been more accurate?
I've no idea. Possibly frightened of the anti-aircraft guns, despite their seeming ineffectiveness. Several of the men in the interviews commented that if they'd just come lower, that they'd have had a much better chance of hitting something. Yeah. Perhaps more humour. This is Troop Sergeant Major John Whitehorn. This is classic squaddy humour you should appreciate. They had a dummy airfield and railhead nearby. The camouflage people used to shift dummies about each day. They'd oil fires, which they set off when the Italians came over bombing in the hope they'd bomb the dummies rather than Mercer Matruh. There were a lot of dummy aeroplanes made out of painted mess tables. It was said that when the Italians came over and bombed them, they bombed them with wooden practice bombs. So, in other words, the Italians played the game and just dropped wooden practice bombs on them. I quite like the thought that the sort of goon show surrealism. And we mentioned this before. The goons were, of course, North African veterans, Milligan and Seagund. They both served in North Africa.
Oh, you mean Harry Seacombe?
Harry Seacombe, yes.
Oh.
Some of the chaps got really edgy, and Gunner Bill Adams said, "This is the sympathetic approach of the British Army to a man suffering from the stress of war." Some of the chaps were very nervous and went rather bomb-happy. I hit one bloke in the jaw to quieten him down because he was raving, shouting, "We're going to get killed. They're going to kill us." But most men sort of managed to sort of suppress their fears. And eventually in September, the hurricanes start to arrive, and the risk of air raids backs off after that sort of 3 months of intermittent high-level bombing. There were deaths. Edward Batt, the second in command, was killed. And the way he was killed makes you realise that just the randomness of war. He was in his dugout, but there was a bit of a gap, and a splinter hit him in the ankle. He got a couple other wounds, and one wasn't noticed, and he got gangrene, and he died.
Mm.
Now, what should we talk?
I was just going to say that you mentioned, and I think we've touched on it in previous podcasts, while this is happening, you've got the Battle of Britain. Presumably, not only were they having to worry for themselves, but they were worrying about their families still. Yeah,
because worried sick because the Battle of Britain, and then the bombing starts in the Blitz starts in September. So they've got their families. They're really worrying, and they're getting letters from home. But you can't pick up a mobile phone or go on Skype or Zoom or Facebook Messenger in those days. It was very difficult to communicate with people.
But presumably there was a lot of effort put into making sure that they could get letters from home.
Oh yes. But occasionally ships would be sunk and they'd lose letters. They'd send parcels out. Sometimes the Army Service Corps would get them.
Yeah.
Health. There's a lot of. I mean, they're living in the desert, and there's various health problems. Starting to come up, and some of them were almost, immune. To the bite. Now, this is something that means a lot to me. As you know, if I get bitten twice at Gallipoli, I swell up like a giant balloon, a wasp or a flea, and it's awful. And this is Ian Sinclair, and he says, Sergeant Ian Sinclair, he says, the sand fleas used to bite me. Other people used to have them, and they'd itch, but I'd be covered in great big wheals as big as a half crown after a bad night, which used to stay for several hours before they'd go down again. I used to take my bed to bits, give it a good shaking, put DDT powder in it, but I'd lose hours of sleep on account of them. When he says bed, it's a makeshift bed out of packing cases and things. And these bites would turn into desert sores. Now, do you know what a carbuncle is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I used to get them when I was young. And they're just sort of like a crater in and this is Lance Bombardier Ken Chew. He said, if you're a type with sensitive skin like I was, you get a little scratch. I'd be infected very soon. Next thing you know, you had a desert sore, like a bomb crater. The skin all round was all sort of tender and red, pussy, but sort of oozing pus, and sunken in the middle. My legs at times would be completely bandaged. And they could grow to the size of a small orange filled with this horrible pus. It's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, sounds great. And of course, you're not in the greatest of conditions to have a skin complaint anyway, because you've got the heat and the sand and everything else.
Yeah, everything's going against you. And there's flies everywhere. And we're both aficionados of Gallipoli. The flies were everything. And, they were trying to drink their tea. They'd be wafting their hand to keep the flies away. But the trouble with them flies is that those flies, the favourite food of flies, we always used to say, is shit and jam. And so the flies would sort of meander between the latrines. Lovely. And the men's food, they'd be trying to eat their food. And then the open sores are a bit of a target for your discerning fly as well.
So was there stomach problems as well? Were there dysentery outbreaks and that sort of thing?
Well, we've always called this in our social circle Baynes disease after a rather unfortunate outbreak of that said disease while we're in Gallipoli. You possibly remember it. I still remember when you had to
fondly.
You had to retire to that latrine. As a matter of urgency on the island of Imbros, Scotchada. I'll never forget the sort of screams coming out and the sort of birds flying away and all the rest of it.
Yes, anyway, the South Notts Hussars.
Are you changing the subject, old chum?
Yeah, subtle that, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Let's let more.
So,
humor.
did they get any leave, Peter? And did they get back to the UK or to Cairo?
They get back to Cairo, and what do you think was on their mind when they went to Cairo?
That wasn't why I asked, by the way, but I can imagine all the temptations of a city. I should imagine.
That's right. The men are basically looking for drink and women. And that's just the way it was, and I don't think you can blame them. But of course, while they were doing that, they were thinking of their, what do you think their wives and girlfriends are up to back home? They've got lots of temptations as well. I mean, when you're that age, people are away for 6 months. That's a lifetime. And there's a thing called Dear John letters. Have you heard of them? Did you used to have them in the army in your days?
I used to get a few.
I'm surprised that you had a few girlfriends, to be absolutely honest. But I suppose you were younger, thinner, just generally more gorgeous eye candy then.
I used to get them from my parents.
Now you make me laugh. And one of the quotes I enjoy was from a bloke called Albert Swinton, who's a Lance bombardier, and he was he was sort of my height, your build, with the muscles you had when you were a boxer. He was a really good, and he was tough, hard, manly. He was hairy-arsed, I think is the expression that they used to use in the army. And he got one of these Dear John letters, and I just love it because it shows that beneath the most stern, horrible exterior lies a lovely romantic heart. He said this: prior to the war, I'd been courting a girl, a policeman's daughter. I'll leave the name out, I think. When I was at Mercer Matruh, she wrote a horrible letter accusing me of being out of the way. You must remember, we just had Dunkirk and all the rest of it. And me being out in the Middle East, in the sunshine, enjoying myself, according to her. Couldn't care less about the people back home. I wrote and tried to put things right, but she didn't want to know. Next thing I knew, I was told by my parents, that she was going out with all and sundry and gone right off the rails. I thought to myself, well, fair enough. Perhaps it's just as well I'm out of the way. But as I always try and say, they'd have a lot more to worry about soon, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite extraordinary that there's any sort of view that they're on some sort of holiday excursion and that they're out on some sidelines watching what's happening at home.
Well, the war is just about to, but I've got one quote I missed out before, and I lose my place quite easily. And this is from Ray Ellis. It's the humour of the army, and they used to get beer bottles from the NAFI. It was beer bottles then, not cans. And he said, we used to keep beer in the gun barrel, that's of the guns, to keep it cool. You close the breech and drop them down. We had a general officer come to examine the position, and by this time we were all black because we'd worked naked virtually, just a pair of shorts. That's all we wore for months. And he said to someone, is it wise to have native troops so near the front? They were just sunburnt, of course. And the colonel said, "Bwah! These are the South Notts Hussars." The general was most apologetic. Having said this, he went to the gun and opened the breech, and plonk, plonk, plonk. Out came the bottles of beer as they slid down the breech and dropped on the ground. He just looked round, closed the breech silently. Nothing was said. He'd called us native troops, so he owed us that, didn't he? I love that. Anyway, but the war is starting. 13th of September, the Italian commander, I have to look this up, Marshal Rodolfo Graziano. Yeah, that sounds right. He got his nerve up, and his 10th Army began a cautious advance across the border, the Libyan border, into Egypt. In front of them, the 7th Armored Division fall back, but the Italians only move forward about 60 miles to Sidi Barrani, and then they stop and start digging fortified camps: Maktila, Tumar East, Tumar West, Nibuewa, Bir Rabia, and Safafia. I remembered all that. I didn't look that in my notes at all, Gary.
Well done.
Now, why did the Italians stop? Are they cowardly custards? What's going on? Well,
is it fair to say that I'm going to put this in here now? it's not that they're cowards. It's not that they're even, poor soldiers. Was it not that they suffered from a lack of leadership? And in fact, they didn't have the natural resources or the equipment.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because a bit of understanding of the Italian situation is crucial, I think. For a start, they thought we'd got 200,000 soldiers in Egypt, not 36,000, and that makes them naturally cautious, and with good bloody reason. Their intelligence was poor. They had a lack of mechanized transport. Their tanks, their artillery were obsolescent crap. It's not easy for them. Anyway. The advance makes the British reorganise their defences again. And what happens this time is that the Egyptians, remember they were guarding the safe end, the eastern perimeter. Well, they can't be trusted, can they? So they're replaced by 3 British battalions and the 8th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, And there was a bit of panic at first. Are the Italians coming? Are the Italians coming? But they don't, because they're too worried. They're there's a desert in front of them. There's 200,000, they think, British troops ahead of them. They don't really do anything. They just dig these fortified camps. What's going to happen next? And here we have a bit of generalship, good generalship. The British Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, was a chap called General Sir Archibald Wavell. And he told Lieutenant General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson, what a posh name, the local commander, to plan on a large-scale 5-day raid by the Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, to force the Italians back. And if it succeeded, they were to really exploit anything that happened. So the plan is produced for Operation Compass. They always give them these names. This is Operation Compass. And the main assault force would be the 4th Indian Division. They'd swoop into the desert and then come round to attack 3 of the camps from behind. The 7th Armoured Division would screen off this, and the Selby Force, under Brigadier Arthur Selby, an imaginative name for the force, would come from the Mercer Matruh garrison. And they'd go straight east along the coast and pin the 1st Libyan Division, Cibele, into Maktila Camp, which is 10 to 15 miles east of Sidi Barrani. So forget all the rest I said. Maktila Camp's all that matters, and this force, Selby Force, is going to push towards it. Now, why are we bothered with this? Well, the South Notts Hussars are involved. There's a composite battery created, and it's made up, commanded by Major Bob Daniel. And those of you who listen to all these podcasts will hear about his name with lots of spitting and saying bastard when it comes to the actual Battle of Knightsbridge. But he was then in 8th Field Royal Regiment, and he is in command of the whole of this composite battery. And there's 3 bit elements. E Troop from 8th Field, X Troop with 4 converted 18 25-pounders. They're 18-pounders that have been bored out and made into 25-pounders. And they're commanded by Captain Bob Hingston. They're from the South Notts Hussars. And then, ludicrously, a dummy troop under Major Jerry Birkin. 1 18 25-pounder conversion and 8 dummy troops. It's made out of wood. With cordite flares to go and people and things to go bang and provide a flash.
And were they getting any support from the RAF or the Royal Navy at this time?
As they move along the coast, it's crucial because there's not many of them. I mean, there's a couple of battalions of infantry, that's all, and this battery. And the RAF is pounding the bases, the Italian bases, and the Royal Navy is in place off the coast. Now, wow!
I think actually it's the Warspite, isn't it, off the coast?
Oh, my favourite ship. I love the Warspite. 8 times 15-inch guns, supported by the Terror. 2 15-inch guns. These 15-inch guns. Have you seen the ones outside the War Museum? You know those big bangy things outside the War Museum?
Yeah.
If they fired, and this, just to give you the scale, if those guns outside the War Museum fired, they would hit Watford. you know.
Well, can we get them to fire?
Yes, well, no one likes Watford, you know, ghastly place.
And the Warspite was a Queen Elizabeth class super dreadnought, wasn't it?
She was.
It's a great warship.
You're remembering this from our Jutland talk.
I am, yes.
And the shells weighed 1,900 pounds each.
Wow.
I mean, that'd spoil your day. So they're bombarding the camp, and under the cover of this, we move the real guns of the battery, the composite battery, and they open fire, and the dummy troops setting off thunder flashes, you know. And Captain Bob Hingston, he was at this X-troop, you know, the South Notts Hussars part. He said, we started up. The Italians were utterly lamentable. We were pretty green, but they were appalling soldiers. This is what they think. This is not what I think. The first thing I saw, 4 of their guns perched right out in the open, not dug in. Why they put them there when there was quite a bit of cover around, I simply cannot imagine. They started firing. I managed to range onto them and gave them a good plastering, and that was the end of them. They weren't manned again for the rest of the day. Again, I'm pointing out that this is good fun for Hingston, but there's people dying in that oak battery. The main force that I promised not to mention again, they're successful. They're moving round. They're doing a flank march to the south, moving through the desert. This is how they always do it in the Desert War. Somebody attacks straight on to pin them, and the main force moves round in a sort of big sort of left hook. So that's all going well. The Italians abandon Mactilla and start withdrawing towards Sidi Barrani. And at this point, they drop into their action again. And this is Captain Jerry Birkin. And he just gives us, he drives forward because they surrender. They just can't. So he goes forward with 1 officer of the South Staffords and 20 men. And Jerry Birkin said this: when we got to the ridge, hundreds of Itis and Libyans appeared and threw down their arms. I was a bit frightened of it, but I brandished my revolver in the general's face and he said, no ammunition left, which was a lie, as I found 2,000 rounds on one gun. However, everything seemed peaceful, and our 20 men with bayonets controlled the party all right. I took the general's epaulets and hat, just like Mussolini's. Also, I got 2 pistols and the Italian flag. They're now in the South Notts Hussars Museum. They took 5,000 prisoners. And you know, where they'd finished, the camp where they'd finished, sort of lay naked before them. Can you picture it? And what do you think some of the less disciplined British soldiers did?
Well, I should imagine that there was alcohol and they had a thoroughly good time.
Yes. And there's a wonderful quote. Troop Sergeant Major John Whitehorn, who's with the Dummy Troop. And I love this quote because John Whitehorn was a lovely man, but he was quite stiff. You know, well, he was a Troop Sergeant Major. And he said it was a rather eerie sort of situation, being in a deserted enemy camp. I was disturbed by one of the South Staffords who'd got very drunk on stuff they'd been found in the camp and was persistently trying to get on a stray mule. He was getting on one side and falling off the other. This went on pretty well through the night. I just love the concept of this drunken soldier climbing on the mule, hey, and falling off the other side. But again, I'm going to do the horrible side of it because people forget just how awful the casualties were for the Italians. They'd surrendered, but Ray Ellis is put on a burial party with the Royal Engineers. And he's a Lance Bombardier then. He said they were dead all over the place, lying all sorts of grotesque angles everywhere. It was a horrible job. First, I thought we'd dig graves, but that was impossible because it was all rock and there were too many, hundreds and hundreds of them. So much for no resistance. You pick that up, Gary. We hit on the idea of dragging them into any hole we could find and then kick the rocks and sand in on top of them. After the first day or so, these corpses were beginning to swell and smell. We found some big meat hooks in the cookhouse, so we used those. You stuck it under the shoulder and dragged them. We made no attempt to identify anybody. We were treating them like carcasses. We put up a sign with scratched on it 5 Itis, 6 Libyans, or 10 Itis, and we didn't even call them Italians. There was no reverence, no service, no prayer, no respect at all. Nothing. The main thing was to get them under the ground. And I'll tell you now, Ray, he goes on to say how much he regretted his behavior, their behavior, and he felt guilty about that to the end of his days. Because that, you know, the lack of respect for dead opponents.
Well, it's something that you actually want yourself, isn't it? You want to be treated with respect.
Yes. And he said, but what else could they do? There were too many corpses and too few of them on the burial pile.
Well, also, of course, there would be the problems with disease if they didn't do that.
Oh, they had to get them under the ground. Yeah. Now, Operation Compass was a fantastic success. You know, Richard O'Connor, it was a 5-day raid, but they'd taken all the Italian camps over at the Egyptian border. They'd taken 38,000 prisoners in all, captured 237 guns, as you imagine, I'm reading this, and 73 tanks. I think we all have gathered that statistics aren't my thing. So when I give a statistic accurately, it's red.
So what size was the Italian force? 38,000 prisoners is staggering. What size was
Well,
the
it was
Italian
a full
force?
army. So, but I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know. It was, more like 200,000. That's a guess. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You've exposed a weakness there.
One.
So the 10th Army's in. It retreats back into Libya, and we pursue them, advancing further and further into Libya. At this point, one of my all-time favourite geostrategic geniuses intervenes. Guess who it is?
Oh, I should imagine a politician by any chance?
Yes.
I don't know, Churchill?
Yeah. Churchill suspends Wavell's offensive on the 9th of February and stripped the Western Desert Force to the bone to reinforce his campaigns he thought in Abyssinia and Greece.
Yeah.
I wonder what will happen next. What do you think will happen next?
Disaster now, isn't it? You can't defend what you've gained.
That's right. And the Germans will arrive. But that's a story for a different day. The South Notts Hussars, January 1941, they're sent to the Suez Canal area. And there they had one of the most unusual jobs I ever remember recording about. They were split into 4-man posts all along the Suez Canal. And they had 2 functions. One, to shoot down German army with their Bren gun. And then to mark the location of any mines the Germans dropped in the canal or they attacked. They were German raids, these apparently. The idea was they'd have 2 sticks, and the old thing. So 2 of them would mark, and where the sticks crossed would be where where the line from the sticks crossed would be where the mine was, because that was their function really, to stop the Germans or mining the canal or identify the location of mines so they could be cleared up by the Royal Navy.
It sounds almost Blackadder-like, doesn't it? It's marking the position of the war elephants.
Yeah, what have you got? And do you know what? The 2 sticks are ludicrous, but trying to shoot down something with a Bren gun is pretty ridiculous as well. And Ted Holmes was on one of these posts with Sergeant Staniforth, and he says this: all of a sudden, we saw coming down a canal a big German plane, really low. Sergeant Staniforth, let's go at it with a Bren gun. Unfortunately, it had been blowing sand all day and wouldn't fire automatically. He only got 5 shots in it as it went past. A light appeared, and I said, I think that's got it. He was from Chesterfield. I think that's got it. I thought, we'd hit it. Next thing, there's a big mine coming down, swinging down on a parachute, about the size of a 50-gallon drum by the look of it, seemingly just above our head. It landed towards the other side of the canal. We got some bits of stick, and we were putting these sticks to point where it had dropped and let the Navy know. When it blew up, it bowled us over the blast. And that was their job. And for a while, that's what they were doing. Now, apparently it helped. But I want to go on now to another element of humour from Ray Ellis. And this is a wonderful story. And I think of these two as I think of you during your glorious service in the army in Germany, saving us all from the communist threat. Because I know you did. I think personally you undermined the whole Soviet regime by your presence in Germany. You certainly undermined everybody else. Anyway, this is Ray Ellis. He says they were out on leave and they went to Port Suez. We got to Port Suez to see 2 soldiers walking up the road, dragging a 3rd man by his ankles with his head in the gutter. Absolutely paralytic, the 3 of them. One was so drunk he couldn't walk. I remember saying to Bob Folds, this is disgusting. It's just the type of thing that gets the British Army a bad name abroad. While we were looking with disgust at these 3 soldiers, I realised that one was Fred Lamb, it's a mate of his, and the other was Wag Harris, another mate of his. I said to Bob, "That's Fred and Wag. The other must be my brother. The one with his head in the gutter must be my brother." It was.
I think one of the things that strikes me about that is the fact that, in time of war, it's this type of thing that gets the British Army a bad name. I thought that was rather charming.
Yeah, not the killing and
not the killing, no, not the being in a different country, but the drunkenness. Yes, I can see why you've mentioned me in that breath. I've spent quite a lot of time with my head in gutters, actually.
Yes. Well, it's what made some of those contusions so obvious when we see videos of you. Now, it was a bit dull, so perhaps they've got good, the Suez Canal, but they reckon that some 250,000 tons of vital war shipping could be released when the waterway was reopened, because it had been closed by the mines. We're quite near the end for this session, but 9th of March, they moved to Hague. And there they get their new weapons, the old 18-pounders, the 4.5 howitzers, the old field artillery from the First World War days. They're handed in, and they're issued with sparkling new 25-pounders. And everybody is delighted. This is Bob Folds. He's a Lance Sergeant by then. He says, "We were impressed with the 25-pounder as a weapon. For a start, it was a gun howitzer. In other words, the projectile and the charge were separate, so you had a variable range. You could either put in the highest charge and elevate the gun to get the longer range on a flat trajectory, or you could put in a low charge, cock up the gun, and get a much shorter range, but you could fire over hills. It was very flexible. Very easy to operate. The sights and laying was an advance of what we'd had before with the 18-pounder. Easy to handle because it had a gun platform. You could spin it round very easy. And by this time, 1941, it's a proven weapon. Before they had First World War crap. Now they have the real thing. I mean, it wasn't crap. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. It was excellent in the Great War. But by 1940,
vintage, I think.
It was vintage. Vintage, yes. So are you vintage then, Gary?
No, I'm antique.
Anyway, at this point, they're also training for deployment under Churchill's mad plans they're going to the island of Rhodes. And there's just a couple of last daft quotes that I think you might enjoy. This is Gunner Albert Parker. They were going to land off landing craft. And Gunner Albert Parker said, "They said, you'll be pleased to know that they expect 80% casualties." That put the wind up everybody. It would me. We got on one boat, which took 22 men and one vehicle. The pilot took us so far out in the canal, and then he'd say, "Right, we're coming back again to land." When we came to land, we'd say, "Get closer in or we'll get bloody wet." He said, "I can't." He said, "This is an invasion. You might be in 9 foot of water. You've got to be prepared for it." So they dropped them in this water. Well, South Notts Hussars said, "Bollocks to this." And they got them to move closer onto a shallow shelf. And this is another quote from Albert Parker. You'll love this, because our Sergeant Major, Jim Hardy, said, "That's no bloody good. Don't forget you're going to invade Rhodes. You'll see lots of water over there. Take it round again and I'll show you how it's done." He did. He didn't find that shelf. It disappeared. Funny thing, he got a tin hat on and it started to float on the water and then disappeared. He was down below. He'd gone. When they pulled him out, we said, "Like that, Sergeant Major."
Yeah, it's always wonderful when things like that go wrong.
Well, they never got to the Greek islands and Churchill's scheme because somebody else is waiting for them. Do you know who that is?
Well, I should imagine it's Erwin Rommel, isn't it? Doesn't he make an appearance and brighten up everybody's life?
The Desert Fox and the Siege of Tobruk. And that's what we'll be looking at next time, the Siege of Tobruk. And then things get really serious. But I hope you've enjoyed this. This is the last time, in a sense, that the South Notts Hussars aren't up to their eyes in war. This is the end of anything calm. That was the calm before the storm. Tobruk is the storm.
Yeah, and I'd just like to point out that, from my perspective, I think that it's really interesting the contrast and the juxtaposition between the tragedy and the death and their humour. Their humour is still there. It's still shining through.
It is, and all the way through at Tobruk as well. They're funny. They're amusing themselves. They're trying to distract themselves from the horrors of war.
Well, Thank you, Peter. This experiment in remote podcasting has been really interesting, and I look forward to speaking, although not seeing you again very soon.
In some ways, I find not being able to see you a sort of blessing.
Thank you, Peter.
Cheers, Gary. Bye.